Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Carrie Abrams, Dean of Duke Law School, and I will serve as the moderator for this session on the future of the university in the U.S. research and innovation ecosystem. We are fortunate to have the heads of 4 major universities in this panel. So rather than spending our time reading their biographies, which are available on the conference website, I'll just list the speakers right now. They are Rebecca Blank, Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Shirley Ann Jackson, President of the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, Farnam Jahanian, President of Carnegie-Mellon University, and Vincent Price, President of Duke University. So each speaker will have opening remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So please use the Zoom Q&A function if you have questions. Let's begin by giving the floor to Rebecca.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm very honored to be here, and I really appreciate Duke putting together what is clearly a really fascinating set of discussions on this whole topic. I want to talk a little bit about how universities can contribute to the whole ecosystem that interfaces universities with business, with industry, with commercialization. But let me start by saying that universities do 2 things that are very, very important to that ecosystem. One is they prepare the high-skilled workers, whether they are software engineers or biochemists, that many of these companies absolutely rely on. I'm not going to talk about the education side, but I don't want to dismiss that because it is so important. Secondly, universities are obviously the place where ideas and discovery take place. And fundamental knowledge creation, which over time feeds into new products and improved ways of doing things that really drives innovation and discovery. And I must say, both of these, the education and the innovation, are absolutely necessary to be happening at a first-rate level if you're going to keep the US economy on the front edge of a global economy. So let me come back and talk about what universities can be doing more of to engage in that interface of ideas and discovery. And comment number 1 may be sort of obvious, but it's one that I think many of us are still not where we need to be. And that is, we need to make it a positive thing for our faculty to be engaged in a commercialization process when their ideas lead to something that is of interest. We all sit inside institutions that have a lot of traditions, and some of those traditions have validated much more theoretical work over more applied work. And my university, like many others, is really trying to change that in our tenure rules, in our promotion rules, in our salary adjustment rules, so that faculty who want to engage in more applied commercializable work coming out of their research actually are validated for that. Secondly, supporting the infrastructure that lets creative ideas turn into something that can be used outside the university is deeply important. And there's some of our faculty who are never going to engage in this. If you're a theoretical physicist, that's just fine, right? But there are faculty who are increasingly interested in thinking not just about their own area, but how the discoveries and ideas that they have in their labs or in their offices can in turn translate into something of use in a larger environment. And that's really hard because very few of our faculty are in any way skilled at doing the type of business development and movement from idea to something that might be of interest to as a commercial product. That's not something you learn in graduate school. Some people learn it on their own. Many just don't have the right set of skills. So you need to put an infrastructure of support around this. And that's legal support, that's business advice, that's mentoring by people who actually know how to do this. It's support through venture capital and the type of financial support that you often need to move an idea forward. This isn't easy, and I must say for many faculty members, this isn't what they should be doing. They may have an idea that has real promise, but they're not the ones who are going to take that from that point to the point where it might be of interest to be sold off to a company or to be used in some way, spun into a product. And putting together a set of really skilled staff, mentors, alumni, who either work with a faculty member or even take the idea over and move it forward and see how far it can go is increasingly important. And again, I think we're all learning how to do that better than we have in the past. And then I would also say, in terms of that type of support, there's a lot of discussion of entrepreneurship and creation of new companies and new products. That's not unimportant, but it is equally valuable to be engaged with the old big companies that are very successful out there, that have their own research labs, and then want to engage in you in long-term partnerships where your faculty's ideas, are, they sort of get first look at the ideas and decide if they want to take them on and translate them. And those sorts of industry partnerships with the automotive industry, or, with healthcare industry, are just as important, that we be doing them and doing them well, as our support for new companies and new products. There's often a lot of IP issues that get raised in those sorts of partnerships. That has to be dealt with, and dealt with well. But more universities, I think, have more experience in that type of partnership than in the entrepreneurship space at this point. Finally, the last thing I'd say in terms of this is that don't forget the theorists. Don't forget the non-applied people, because if you really ask in the long run, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, what type of ideas and discovery matters, the ideas that today seem to have absolutely no application outside of, of interest within a very small group of the discipline, often turn out to have enormous applications. And if you look at whether, it's GPS or the phones we all carry around, or, all of the new technologies that are out there, many of them are based on very arcane discoveries. And supporting that type of basic science is the backbone for the long-term development and idea establishment. So let me end by just noting a few things we're doing at Wisconsin that I'm excited about and I think are interesting. This may not be unique to other schools. We have 4 entrepreneurship educational programs. We've got an undergraduate entrepreneurship major in our business school. We have an undergraduate certificate for those who are not in the business school. And we have people from almost every major across campus who've engaged and received that certificate. We've got a master's degree certificate for our professional masters who are interested in the whole entrepreneurship environment. And we've got a PhD certificate for PhD students who are, out of the research environment, interested in particularly commercializing some ideas and products. And that mix of curriculum has served us very well. Secondly, we had all this stuff happening all over campus. Law school is doing something, the medical school is doing something, our alumni were doing things. None of it was coordinated. So we created a coordinating group, which we call D2P, Discovery to Product. You can look it up on the website at Wisconsin, which really, it doesn't take over any of those functions, but it helps direct people. It knows what's happening across campus in this space, and tries to connect folks across this. So the law school people are talking to the medical school people, and a student who comes in out of the music school and doesn't know where to start, but it's a great idea, gets connected to the sort of support that they need. And that type of central coordination is very important. And then lastly, our intellectual property organization known as the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, WARF, which some of you know about. It's been around for 95 plus years, sits outside the university, but it's really decided that, patenting alone, which is what it did for 90 of those 95 years, is not enough. That they also need to be engaged in putting together venture capital for new startups coming out of the university, in mentoring some of those ideas and accelerating them forward. And even at times taking ownership in some parts of the new companies that are being formed as a way to generate revenue that's very different from the old patenting licensing model that universities have been in the midst of. And thinking creatively about how we think about intellectual property and engage with it on campus and use it is, I think, part of the future. So let me stop there. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. Shirley, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. I'm delighted to join my fellow university leaders today. Well, let me begin this way. The COVID-19 pandemic certainly has underscored how crucial university-based discoveries and innovations are. Our nation was able to develop and deploy highly effective vaccines in a fraction of the usual time because of the foundational research done on modified messenger RNA at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as research at other American universities over decades, including my own alma mater, MIT. Now, innovation has been compared to a coral reef in which previous discoveries and innovations lay down the substrate upon which new discoveries and innovations grow. But the question is, what can universities do after the shock of our current pandemic and other crises to ensure the continuous health of the reef? Now, one of the greatest constraints we face, of course, is financial. Public investment in research and development have not kept pace with increasing competition from other nations. And they've not kept pace with the realities of our lives and our economy. Now, during the mid-1960s, another era of great powers tensions as we're experiencing today, as much as 11.7% of the federal budget was devoted to R&D. And to get today, we're under 3%. So the federal share of funding, in fact, for academic research and development has fallen from about 60% in 2010 to 50% in 2019. And universities are forced to seek out ever more private philanthropy or to compensate with their own funds. And these things have advantages and disadvantages. But because many graduate students are supported by federal funding, this can have an effect of narrowing the pipeline for future innovation because there is no innovation without innovators. Now, of course, there have been bills, innovation bills passed by both the House and Senate recently, and the eventual consensus bill may improve the situation. But I would point out that these bills have not been funded through the budget process otherwise. As recently pointed out in Science magazine, any increase in research funding may be largely aspirational. Now, as Rebecca just said, we know that open fundamental research undergirds our innovation engine. However, the funding in earlier times for fundamental research, and we sometimes forget this, was driven by national purposes, particularly coming out of World War II, and especially after the Soviet launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite. And that means that to truly have continual support and to truly deliver important discoveries and innovations to the world, sometimes we need more than funds from the federal government. We need strategic focus to be able to really contribute to national and global needs and to have that constancy of support. And we need it especially because of an underappreciated reality of our highly interconnected world, which we're learning more today. And that is that when there is a triggering event, we all are subject to intersecting vulnerabilities with cascading consequences. Clearly, the appearance and spread of SARS-CoV-2 is such a triggering event. Other recent examples, and not on the same scale, but having a global impact, include the container ship Ever Given becoming wedged in the Suez Canal last March and disrupted an estimated $10 billion of global trade per day, and the freeze in Texas in February of 2021, which caused a grid failure that shut down the world's largest petrochemical complex and caused shortages of the chemical compounds used to make an array of products. And so we live in a world with inherent instabilities that involve, of course, climate change, the security of cyber systems, non-state actors, and geopolitical tensions. And so these kinds of triggering events are likely to become more frequent if we don't work actively to forestall them. And so the real issue then is to have an understanding at all levels that in the face of this kind of risk environment, our powerful innovation ecosystem needs to become both more agile and more robust. Now, the federal government, of course, has a key role here. Risk assessments at the federal level have to become more holistic and integrated, examining the effect of one risk on another and identifying possible potentiating effects. But as well, in conjunction with universities and industry, the government could do better planning for hazards that could compound other hazards and offer funding for discoveries and innovations designed to respond to and mitigate them as part of an overall innovation policy. And these are things that our faculty and our students are increasingly interested in. However, when crises emerge, we have to be able to quickly assemble resources and to mobilize and coordinate across sectors, all aspects of our innovation system, from research through manufacturing and distribution. Now, there are precedents for such cross-sectoral resource pooling beyond what I mentioned at the beginning. An example being in 2020, my university with others, including Carnegie-Mellon and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, joined forces with IBM, the DOE National Laboratories, and others to create the COVID-19 High Performance Computing Consortium. Members lent time on their world-class supercomputers, as well as their in-house expertise to researchers at any institution, taking on a computationally intense approach to studies of COVID-19. Now, important findings and learnings emerged from the consortium projects, including the identification of drug compounds that could be repurposed for COVID-19 infections. But importantly, with the consortium as a model, the National Science and Technology Council now has published the blueprint for a national strategic computing reserve to provide standing computing support for future emergencies. And we're part of that. But as we look specifically at universities and what universities themselves can do as individual institutions, as well as how they work with others to foster cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary efforts to address sweeping risks and challenges. At Rensselaer, then, we operate very consciously within a paradigm we term the new Polytechnic. And, that comes from, the idea of being skilled in many arts. And at Rensselaer, we view ourselves as a crossroads then for collaborations across sectors, disciplines, geographies, and generations, focused on humanity's greatest challenges and enabled by the most advanced tools and technology. And so over the course of my tenure, and I've been here a long time, we've encouraged such collaborations by constructing the physical and technological platforms for truly cross-cutting work. Now, one example that may surprise you is our Curtis R. Prim Experimental Media and Performing Arts Center, or IMPACT we call it, which is not only one of the most technologically advanced performing arts centers in the world, but it also is a laboratory for all things digital at human scale. And so we also create intellectual structures for cross-cutting work, including research centers that cross departments and schools. And one example is what we call our Cognitive and Immersive Systems Laboratory, housed at IMPACT, which is creating smart, immersive rooms and classrooms that are able to read, understand, and react to their occupants, supply them with information in real time to enhance group learning and decision-making. Another example is our Institute for Energy, the Built Environment, and Smart Systems, which is addressing what will be an ever-increasing problem, and that is the growth of the population globally, and a population that the World Bank projects will more than double by 2050. And a lot of that will be in urban environments. So based in New York City, EBES, as we call it, includes leading architecture and engineering firms as partners, recognizing that an integrative approach is required to decarbonize the many interconnected systems of our daily lives. And it envisions sustainable infrastructure that is both net zero and climate resilient, including how we can backfit pre-existing structures through the use of renewable energy systems, sentient building platforms, and new materials, which can be integrated then with intelligent communications, transportation, and supply chain networks, as well as the policies, importantly, to support them. And our partner, the Brooklyn Law School, is contributing its expertise on this front. And as others know about, it's not always easy to translate the advances generated in universities to the marketplace. But when universities' resources permit, supporting faculty and student startups until they are de-risked and ready for private investment is valuable. Now, back in 1980, we created probably the first incubator wholly sponsored and operated by a university. And many great companies and other activities emerged from it. But we then moved to a more distributed model of support as large physical spaces in our world became less important to the startups. But also participating in and supporting shared infrastructure for broad-based technology development is another way that universities can contribute to the national innovation ecosystem. And a good example is provided by the 16 Innovation Institutes of Manufacturing USA. This idea came out of a report on advanced manufacturing that I co-authored with Eric Schmidt of then Google in 2011 as a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. And in this case, each institute brings together government, universities, and manufacturers of all sizes to forward a particular type of advanced manufacturing technology, whether we're talking smart systems, robotics, or biopharmaceutical production methods. And the institutes have been successful in moving a number of advanced technologies out of the lab and along the technological readiness scale toward use in industrial enterprises. But again, as I said, there's no innovation without innovators. And so universities have to redouble their focus on broader efforts to develop the human capital and for our innovation ecosystem. And as we all know, minorities and women are extremely underrepresented in a number of science and engineering fields. And in some cases, we appear to be moving backwards. In 1998, 27% of bachelor's degrees in the computer sciences were awarded to women. 20 years later, that share had declined to 20%. Now, I long have referred to and termed our national failure to draw on the full complement of talent and draw it into our innovation ecosystem a quiet crisis. And that includes both attracting exquisite talent from abroad, but developing, importantly, our domestic talent pool. And by being strategic about outreach and recruiting, by increasing financial aid, and by eliminating the structural barriers and biases within their own institutions, universities can help to draw women and minority students into science and engineering, to inspire them with possibilities, and in the process, make our cultures even more welcoming to those from abroad. So I thank you for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Farnam, it's your turn next.
Well, it's good to be with you this afternoon. And first, thank you to Duke University Center for Innovation Policy for hosting this conference. Delighted to join my distinguished colleagues, fellow presidents for this important and timely conversation. You know, throughout this nation's history, a thriving research and innovation ecosystem has served as the foundation for broad economic prosperity, for national security, and individual and collective well-being. As my colleagues mentioned this, U.S. research universities are playing a critical role in our nation's innovation ecosystem. And these universities are powerful engines for discovery that fuel regional and national economic growth. While the two core missions of the university, as Becky mentioned, are mission to educate the next generation and also advance knowledge to benefit society have not changed. I would argue that we're at a critical inflection point for our academic institutions and perhaps for our society. And there are three realities that make this moment uniquely different, perhaps, than any other time in our history. President Jackson, Shirley mentioned, in fact, the COVID-19, and I think that's really an important reality that I think has to be considered. But I want to highlight three others that overlaps with some of what's been said. First and foremost, we've seen an unprecedented acceleration in pace, scale, and scope of scientific and technological advances over the last decade or two. We're in the midst of profound societal and economic transformation that's been catalyzed by rapid advances in digital technologies, not to mention unprecedented access to data and by a powerful convergence of cross-disciplinary knowledge and methods and expertise. This convergence of disciplines, of course, is catalyzing discovery and innovations in addressing many of our societal challenges. And at the same time, these technological advances are also reshaping businesses and markets and even changing the nature of discovery itself. I mean, just consider for a moment, on one hand, the successful development of mRNA-based vaccines was possible because of investment in research and in convergent developments in not only basic research over the past decade, but also combined with the ability to engineer proteins that mitigate the virus. And on the other hand, you look at artificial intelligence and automation, perhaps one of the most important intellectual developments of the last decade or two that's reshaping markets and transforming every sector of the economy. The second reality is the intense competition and increasing global competition that I think we're in. As Shirley mentioned, the US R&D engine has been the envy of course the world. In fact, our global partners and competitors are now replicating exactly the successful model that has benefited our nation for the past 50 to 75 years. Data that in fact relates to some of the data that's been mentioned is the US R&D investment has been stagnant between 2.7 as percentage of GDP, I should say, between 2.4 and 2.7 for almost 5 decades. So there's a need to consider that in this global competition is not just in discovery and innovation, but also we're in a global race for talent, particularly in STEM-related fields. And finally, the third point as context for the discussion and some of the thoughts that I want to share with you is that there's a widening economic opportunity gap that's leaving too many Americans behind. We realize that digital transformation, globalization has contributed to a profound reshaping of our workforce, and that's going to continue for decades to come. But persistent barriers to access and opportunity are also preventing the benefits of this innovation-based economy that we're creating, and academic institutions are at the center of that, at catalyzing it. But it's preventing from the entire society from benefiting from it widely, and the benefits being shared widely by all members of our society. We're in fact witnessing potentially disenfranchisement of a growing segment of our urban and rural communities who can't imagine a pathway into our innovation economy that we're creating. It's clear that our research universities have an opportunity, and one would probably argue a moral obligation, to commit more intentionally to advancing this shared prosperity and creating opportunities for all citizens. So with this context, I want to talk about the role that universities can play in leveraging our investment in R&D, in accelerating the innovation economy that we're all benefiting from. I think we all agree that that universities could serve potentially as a linchpin for a coordinated all-nation response to these realities. The couple of thoughts that I want to share with you. One is that, and this echoes what President Jackson mentioned, we need to invest and out-innovate, and that is so urgent at this moment in time. We need to invest in research that matches the accelerated pace and scope of discovery and innovation that we're seeing. Fortunately, we're beginning to see some bipartisan support in the nation for this, in support for the Competes Act, Make America Act, U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. I'm optimistic that we're at a moment that we're going to see continued support for this. While there are issues to be resolved, these issues still should not diminish the significance of potential bipartisan consensus that may be developing around investment in our research, development, and innovation ecosystem of this country, and redoubling our effort in investing in our education and research. Of course, we have not had this level of bipartisan support, I think you all agree, in recent years, but perhaps this is a unique moment for the nation. The second point is that as we invest in research, especially at our research universities, it's important to understand that scientific discovery and technological innovations and technology transfer occurs along a dynamic continuum, from foundational discovery to applied research to building prototypes, to building essentially operational systems and transferring that knowledge and technology to practice. In other words, we can't merely spend money to improve our competitiveness. We have to be very intentional about it. And it also potentially requires rethinking and reimagining our research and innovation ecosystem. Very quickly, the current moment, I think, creates an imperative for some people that we need to choose between curiosity-driven research versus use-inspired research. I think this is a false choice. Scientific exploration and technological innovations occur rather along this continuum, as I mentioned earlier. And in fact, a historic strength of American innovation ecosystem has been the role of federal government in de-risking investments that are necessary along this continuum, especially at both ends of the continuum. Along with the foundational research across all disciplines, we also need to invest in use-inspired research that's motivated by our national priorities, and I think one of our speakers already mentioned that, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's sustainability, transportation, clean energy, public health, and so on and so on. And specifically to create innovative solutions that meet our national priorities, we need to recognize that we also need to invest in building these emerging technologies that we've been talking about, whether it's in artificial intelligence, whether it's autonomy, whether it's advanced manufacturing, in certain areas of material science, biotechnology, quantum computing, and so on and so on. This really does mean that being very, very, very intentional about investment in this continuum. And finally, the point I want to make is that we also need much bolder strategies for transitioning discoveries from lab to market and expanding the geography of US innovation. My colleagues who've spoken already have already talked about this. I want to acknowledge that overwhelming majority of our research institutions in this country are doing this already. They're embracing bolder strategies for transitioning discoveries from lab to practice. And in fact, some of us may be ahead of others, but this is something that I think all academic institutions, especially our research institutions, recognize. So a few ideas, for example, in the context of being very intentional about the role of university, the role that we can play in this innovation ecosystem. We have a unique opportunity to scale existing tech transfer programs and to incentivize earlier engagement with industry and regional innovation ecosystem to accelerate discovery from research to commercial impact. We also need to design flexible policies, and President Blank mentioned this already. We need to create the context and conditions for innovation. For example, much more flexible leave and tenure policy, promotion policy for our faculty who want to engage in this. And Carnegie-Mellon, I say this with a great deal of pride, goes back to years of essentially forward thinking by my predecessors. I've really embraced that. For the past several decades, I've really embraced the much more progressive policies for supporting faculty in this time. In fact, this fusion of people and ideas underpins the productive interplay of public and private sector that we need to nurture. And universities also need to be very intentional in terms of partnering with their surrounding communities for regional and economic development, to motivate research-based solutions to urban and rural challenges. At CMU, we're really proud of the fact that we call the Pittsburgh region as our living laboratory in terms of how we connect with the community to bring our research and education to bear to benefit society. And we believe, in fact, being intentionally focusing on our region has an added benefit. We're a global institution, as all of you know, but it actually has the added benefit of directly serving the community through the education and research work that we do and the innovation that comes out of that. Excuse me. Of course, in the face of stronger global competition, we need to engage more Americans in this innovation-based economy, which means capitalizing on geographically diverse and often untapped sources of creativity and innovation. There was a Brookings studies, in fact, that found that 90% of the technology-related job growth has taken place in just 5 coastal areas. There's a rapid change that's happening. There's a lot of essentially resources are being brought to bear, but that's an important question that we need to ask ourselves. How can we make the future that we're building work for everyone across the country? Answering these questions will, of course, impact how we recruit students, how we educate them, how we work with our partners, both in the public and the private sector, to transfer our discovery and innovation to society. To wrap up this part, I'm reminded of something that President Biden recently said. He was visiting Carnegie-Mellon at Mill 19, which is our facility for advanced manufacturing and robotics. And he was here to give a national address on strengthening our economies, supply chains, and revitalizing American manufacturing. In his speech, the president highlighted the importance of collaboration and public-private partnerships and how academic institutions can play a catalyzing role in that. In fact, President Biden said, the manufacturing resurgence we're seeing today in Pittsburgh is no accident. It takes local leaders, federal leaders, foundations, businesses, unions, and universities all pulling together. While research universities may serve, and that's end of the quote, and I add to that, that while research universities may serve as the foundation, we have to work together on these complicated societal challenges with the intention, being very intentional in bringing some of the innovations that we have to bear to benefit society and the economic development that comes from that. There's a lot to discuss, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. So our final opening remarks come from my chief, Vincent Price.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Carrie. Thanks to the Center for Innovation Policy, and thanks to you for your leadership of our law school. I'm also very grateful to Chancellor Blank, President Jackson, and President Jahanian for joining us for what I know will be a very productive discussion. I'd like to welcome all to Duke virtually, and also thank them for covering almost all the important points that I might have made in this introduction. I do think this is a very timely discussion for a number of reasons. Here at Duke, we're just a few short years away from celebrating our centennial in 2024. And ours as a university, it was born out of innovation in this moment of ferment in the early part of the 20th century. And we're an institution that has benefited from extraordinary partnerships with research and commercial entities throughout our entire history. And while our experiences have no doubt been very different, I know that the same can be said of Wisconsin RPI and Carnegie-Mellon. But heading into our centennial and reflecting on our past century, on Duke's experience, establishing what is now a world-class academic medical center and building out interdisciplinary schools that are dedicated to public policy and the environment, and through partnerships of vibrant research ecosystem here in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina, I think it's fair to say we have reached another pivotal moment. This moment for Duke and for higher education more broadly will require, I think, unprecedented innovation to continue to support and grow the research capacities that we have built over the past century. To echo some of what Farnam has just said, the technological advances of the past several decades have already produced broad and deep transformational change in markets. They are substantially altering human behavior as well in fundamental ways. The global competition for the finest talent is increasingly costly and intense, even as the public's tolerance of tuition increases and the government's willingness in some ways to subsidize research has either leveled off or waned. The financial fabric that supported research universities since World War II in the US and built an impressive architecture for research is fraying in some ways. And the social fabric is also clearly fraying because of the widening gaps in life chances that characterize our age and which have just been referred to already. So ironically, at the very moment when academic breakthroughs in so many fields stand to improve our lives in dramatic ways, we find that public support of higher education, of the arts, of basic research have been trending downward. So we once again have to look for new ways to secure the future People have already spoken of bold collaborative strategies to define the research environment of tomorrow. And the question was asked of us, first, what do we think are the key constraints and what do we think needs to be done? With respect to key constraints, let me just cite two. I do believe that a lack of public understanding of what we do in higher education, particularly the research work we do, and the loss of public support. Sadly, our institutions have been politicized in many respects. This is clearly a constraint. We need that level of support to carry out our work effectively. I think the pandemic has allowed for a bit of a reversal in public opinion about universities because of the demonstrable contributions we were able to make to our confronting, I hope succeeding in confronting the pandemic. But the longer term trajectories are troubling. A second constraint, I will say, are somewhat ossified institutional structures and practices. We are nimble as institutions. I don't want to overstate this. But in many respects, universities have been delayed in our institutional responses to change. I would say more in our pedagogical work, frankly, than in our research work. I think the pandemic has accelerated some of these responses, but work needs to be done. So what are the things that we need to do? I would say first, this is a moment for us collectively, for our faculties collectively, to rethink the liberal arts for the 21st century. We need to recapture the pragmatic value of the arts, the liberal arts. They are defined as those skills required of a good citizen in liberal society, the skills required to lead a good life, collectively and individually. These are skills. The liberal arts curriculum is a skills curriculum. I think we need to mobilize all of our best thinkers, humanists and social scientists, alongside scientists and engineers, to build stronger interdisciplinary initiatives. We need to be inclusive in our thinking, inclusive of people who have not been brought into this enterprise historically, but inclusive across the disciplines and sensitive to what they have to offer. Science and technology are the accelerants of change, but the course of this acceleration needs to be shaped by ethics, legal thinking, historical understanding, and humanistic value. Here at Duke, we've launched a science and technology initiative where we're seeking to advance transformational research in areas connected to material science, artificial intelligence, particularly as it intersects with health, and biologic resilience. We think we're well positioned to produce discoveries that will save or improve countless lives. We're also trying to make computational thinking, our capacity to use data to create new knowledge, foundational across all academic disciplines. We have an aspiration to become the climate university. We have a school of the environment. We have an institute for policy, environmental policy solutions, but we need to mobilize the whole enterprise, our research, our education, our operations, and our networks, both internal and external, around the challenges of climate change. To do this well, it's not just a science and technology proposition. It's an all of Duke proposition, and I think an all of higher ed proposition. We're in the human talent identification and development business, and we can't afford to be myopic. So when we think about innovation in the context of these discussions, we naturally think about science and technology, and they are foundational, but I think we have to be much broader in our thinking. Second, to echo what Becky, Farnam, Shirley, I think have already stated in different ways, we need to make sure we have the right structures to support innovation and entrepreneurial activity. We're investing in research translation and commercialization work here on our campus to strengthen our capabilities with respect to translational research. We're committed to providing real leadership in these areas to foster a stronger culture of collaboration between companies here in Durham and around the world. And I know we've heard examples already of the way my fellow presidents have similar work underway at their institutions. This is very important, but it requires thought and attention. It can quickly become bureaucratic as opposed to living and breathing in our institutions. Third, we do need to build strong collaborations, and to echo what Farnam said, I think especially regional collaborations. This involves two key steps: coordinating and collaborating across universities. Science is becoming expensive. Research is becoming expensive. It is not a sensible way to proceed if we position ourselves in a competitive posture vis-a-vis other universities. To do the work, we need to do it together. We also need to partner with nonprofits and commercial entities in this work. And one of the things that attracted me to this part of North Carolina is that we have the Research Triangle Park. We have a history of inter-university collaboration. We have not yet optimized our corporate partnership. It's something we're working very carefully on. The second aspect of collaboration has to do with our role in regional planning and policy. We can't just think about innovation. We can't think about just research translation, spin outs. We have to think about housing affordability, workforce development, transportation planning, and economic access for under-resourced communities. They're all of a piece. It's part of a sustainable innovation ecosystem. And our country has produced innovations, hubs, if you will, or ecosystems that have burned white hot now for about 2 decades, but are sadly burning out because they have not been thoughtful about that level of regional planning that takes into account the fullness of life, economic welfare for everybody in the community, and sustainable ways to do this work. So with that, let me just express my gratitude to the center again, and to Becky, Shirley, and Farnam for joining us. Thank you, welcome to Duke, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much to all of you for those wonderful opening remarks. We will be taking questions, so please, those of you in the audience, put your questions into the Q&A. I'd like to kick it off with, I think, what's a follow-up to where you just ended, Vince. All of you talked about the importance of collaboration, and in all sorts of ways. But I also heard from each of you a little bit about some of the barriers to universities doing the kind of work that they want to do in this space. And of course, we heard that a bit in the last session as well, with suggestions that elite universities may be too focused on things like rankings, or too bureaucratic, or too ossified. So I'm wondering, is that characterization true? And if so, what kinds of things can we do to overcome the bureaucratic structures that may sometimes get in our way and prevent us for being as innovative and as collaborative as we'd like to be?
Well, I'll jump in to say, one of the things that I'm a bit troubled by at the moment is the posture of the federal government with respect to antitrust concerns that have reasonable grounds for concern, but are being sort of fit around universities and are actually a barrier right now to collaboration in significant ways. And I just want to put that out there on the table as something we need to think through. The collaborative impulse is strong. I think all of our institutions can point to wonderful and long living collaborations that have been highly successful. But it is a bit challenging. One of the examples, not from the innovation space, that I'll highlight here is that our German doctoral program here is joint with the University of North Carolina. They jointly admit students and manage a PhD program across 2 campuses. And they did it because they realized that we could either in this region have 2, okay German doctoral programs, or 1 impressively strong doctoral program. It's that kind of collaboration and combination of resources that is harder to affect, that I think we need to be looking to.
So I'd jump in to say that, PhD programs are still one of the last of the craft-based programs. You learn to be a researcher by working with researchers. And if we want to teach collaboration and build it, You learn to collaborate by working with people who collaborate. So involving graduate students in these more collaborative projects is important. And part of the problem here is our incentive structures in our universities are still very much centered around disciplines. And it's hard to break that. Who's going to get the indirect money? Who's going to get credit for this? How do you get any credit at all if you do something outside your discipline, but it's your discipline that does the promotion and the salary setting? And figuring out ways to get the incentives right, so incentivize faculty that it's to their benefit to collaborate, and that in turn will incentivize graduate students and give them the training they need. But there's some real inherent tensions between the disciplinary structure on most of our campuses. Even those of us who have these big, wonderful, collaborative, cross-disciplinary centers constantly have tensions between them and the disciplines. And there's some fruitfulness to that. There's a yeastiness to that. But there's also some disincentives to expanding the collaboration.
So I'd like to make a couple comments about that. I so agree with Rebecca. At the same time, I think perhaps there's opportunity in what looks like difficulty. And what do I mean by that? I mentioned in my remarks that the percentage of research supported by the federal government within the universities has declined. It's not just the amount spent on R&D as a function of, as a percentage of our GDP, but rather it has the effect that universities themselves, as well as private philanthropy, and that private can come both in the form of a foundation that supports work, or it could be a partnership with industry. I actually think there are opportunities within that space. And by that, I mean, faculty are also motivated by being able to get support for their work. And so that then it requires what in many universities is a hard decision, but a decision about how to incentivize and use institutional funds, as well as how one can structure partnerships outside the university that have built into them incentives for faculty to cross disciplines and come together. The reason I also mentioned strategic focus, really it's strategic focus linked to national needs and national priorities. And I find that people still are inspired by that kind of thing, including our faculty, and that kind of strategic focus properly funded and used to incentivize faculty can help to break down these barriers. And then finally, I think, there have to be serious discussions within the university about the pathway to tenure and how one measures that. I mean, fields that are considered disciplines today were not disciplines yesterday, computer science being one of them. But it is so critical today. And the other is to take on, so one is working really on multiple levels. One level has to do with how we incentivize and organize at least some of the research in the university. And so, I'm sitting here with the president of a really great university known for its strength in computer science and robotics. But we feel for us, the moment has come to bring data, AI, computation of all kinds, so quantum, neuromorphic, as well as your von Neumann-based computing, bring them together. And to that end, we're creating an institute to do that with a different incentive structure, but it maps back into, but also out of departments. But in order to play, folks have to come together and define what they would do together, what kinds of projects they would do. And we also have a partnership with IBM Research in artificial intelligence. And we have what are called AI Horizon Scholars that have both an advisor from the university, from Rensselaer, and an IBM mentor. And they spend 2 terms during their years of fellowship funding working directly with IBM on a project. I know that Carnegie-Mellon does such things as well. And so these are some of the things that, they aren't perfect, but they do help. Finally, I think we really have to practice what we preach. Namely, I think as far as getting there, we have to look at our core curricula. I was interested, President Price, in your comments about the liberal arts. So, me, I always try to go back and say, well, let's look at the origin of these things. And, when people talked about the trivium and the quadrivium, I kind of make 2 points. One, the trivium is really about, communication, rhetoric, about the structure of language, and about how you think, meaning logic. Then the quadrivium, which was very interesting, and these were liberal arts, were arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. So we've actually created a Bachelor of Science degree in music, which for us, I know you have Mellon, Farnam, but for us, this is a really big deal. And it's technologically inflected, but it has the fundamentals of music theory and composition as well, but also looking at it and how it plays into a digital frame. And we have changed our core curriculum here to put in a data dexterity requirement for all undergraduates across all majors, all schools. Now, that wasn't so easy to do, but we did it. And we also have a communications requirement. And again, all majors, all schools. And it's not just let's teach the engineers how to write a little bit better. It really is about, deep communication. So these are risky. So the real message here is you have to be willing as a university leader to take a risk, to posit these things, to work with the deans, the faculty, and in some ways to, give people a little urge, push them along a bit, but then to put in the right kind of incentives. And so you all, I'm sure, know me, and I've been willing to do that. Now, one could say one puts one's career on the line, but we have our national and global prosperity and security on the line. So that's how I think.
Dean Abrams, I'll be very brief. I know there are other questions that we want to get to, but two really very quick points. One is maybe it's influenced by my own experience at Carnegie-Mellon in recent years and previous experience at University of Michigan, where both Chancellor Blank and I had spent some time at. Again, another amazing public institution, flagship public institution. I'm actually really optimistic that we've come a long way, and I certainly see this at Carnegie-Mellon, that we are breaking down disciplinary boundaries. And in fact, not only it's resonating with our faculty, but more importantly, our students are embracing it. At an undergraduate level, whenever we launch a new interdisciplinary exploration, we see an amazing rush to embrace it. We have one program called Ideate that brings technology, the arts, and humanities together. And it's incredible that about 10% of my undergraduates are taking a course in that new minor that we have developed. We have a neuroscience program that has a home in our science college and our humanities college because of cognitive psychology and cognitive neurology, as well as in our computer science and engineering. So I'm seeing actually a massive shift that it's embraced by both our faculty and our students. I do want to make a second point. Since computer science was brought up and President Jackson was gracious to acknowledge Carnegie-Mellon's long history in computer science and AI. As a trained computer scientist, you probably would be surprised that one of the things that we're dealing with is we recognize that we are educating students today for jobs and markets that have not even been invented or created yet. Because imagine a first-year student that comes to any of our institutions is going to be in the job market for the next 50 years. Imagine that, maybe even longer. So what do we teach them? How do we prepare them? And we know lifelong education is a reality we all have to embrace. So in some ways, I want to echo what Vince said, that in addition to the fact that in the present time, we need to double down on STEM education. There's no question that when you look at the data that China is producing more bachelor degrees in science and engineering than US, Europe, or Japan combined, it is a matter of national competitiveness, the race for talent. So we need to double down on STEM education. There's no question at all levels, K through 12, undergraduate, graduate level, fix the pipeline, all of those things. But at the same time, universities must prepare graduate students, undergraduates, and graduate students, not only for computational thinking, but also prepare students for learning how to learn, for human-centered skills, for being able to deal with complex societal issues, from privacy to policy issues to societal impact of technology. So a broad-based education to support all students, I think it's critical. In addition to the fact that we need to make sure that we have social scientists and humanists that are very much part of, as Vince articulated so masterfully, that are very much part of this innovation economy that we're creating. I think that is fundamental to our success as a society globally, not just the United States, globally. I think that's extremely important. With that, I'll turn it back.
If I could jump in just to follow on that point, actually several of the points have been made. Pedagogies that are problem-based, problem-oriented, and team-based are so powerful for this very reason. I think working with outside clients, starting our students on their own intellectual journeys with problem solving in those teams is a wonderful venue, because the humanist sees that it is a computational problem or has computational aspects. The computational scientist or the bench scientist understands what other people have to contribute. And so this is an instrument of collaboration in a powerful way. It also foregrounds our work as research institutions. So I think what we're learning collectively, and I know there are programs at all of our institutions that are doing this, if we push research down in the curriculum and make it the first experience a student has when they come on our campus, especially if it's team-based and linked to a problem of real concern, something that matters, it's extraordinary what can happen. And you're building these foundational skills that Becky described as necessary, really, to kind of penetrate those disciplinary boundaries. So we have programs like the Vast Connections program here at Duke that have been really wonderful. We have a Data Plus program that really is built around people who have data and need help making sense of it, bring it to us, and we'll assemble teams to work through it. Those are the kinds of programs I think that are extraordinarily powerful.
Well, I actually think, many times we talk about bringing the humanists and social scientists in. There's been this big discussion about bias in AI. If you don't bring people in who think about these things, how are you ever going to get to a state where you're really dealing with this, not as some kind of standalone thing over here, but that's integrated in even how people go about things in the first place. Secondly, we worry a lot about misinformation and disinformation in, our media. Well, there are things to be learned in terms of understanding cultural nuance in social networks, with understanding rhetoric, hierarchies. And you're not going to come to that as the pure computer scientist or the pure mathematician. And so I think these kinds of things are some of the greatest challenges which are that our own students can help us with. And then finally, I was listening to Farnam. We have a thing called ArtX, and it has to do with having our students understand the science in and of art and the art in and of science. Because it's not about it, you add it on. These things are integral. And I think that's where, we're coming to, but we need to go there faster. So we need to really change, what we teach, how we teach, as well as the pathways through the university, and to create more of what I call the experiential opportunities, of which research is one. But we also need, as part of that experiential opportunity, to get the students out of just our campuses so that they really can, see and apply what they're learning. And that's not just for undergrads. To me, it's for graduate students as well.
Shirley Ann, I have a niece who is a proud graduate of that program you just mentioned. So
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Dean Abrams, I'm sure you noticed that you get 4 university presidents together. You don't even have to ask questions. So
The easiest moderating job I've ever had. Yeah. There are some good questions in the chat though, so I wanted to highlight some of them. One question that I thought was particularly interesting follows on the discussion that we've already had a little bit about the decreased funding from the government for R&D. And this question notes that even the share of American corporate funding of upstream research, like basic and applied research as a share of total R&D, has dropped by about 1/3 since the 1980s. So it's not just the government funding. Are you finding that companies are relying more on universities as a source of upstream research? And what does it take for universities to help make up for this shortfall? Just aside of the obvious answer of we want more federal funding.
I can jump in, if I may. There's no question that we see an amazing appetite for the private sector to collaborate with us. In fact, when I was serving as provost prior to current role, one of my biggest challenges was the number of companies that wanted to be on campus or near campus to work with us. It was just totally staggering in terms of that. In fact, if you look at Pittsburgh's renaissance today, and I'll just be very brief about this, Pittsburgh Renaissance, from the days of being the center of steel and the collapse of that economy, has been catalyzed by academic institutions, the healthcare and health sciences industry, plus high-tech industry, which is driven by digitization, AI, automation, robotics, and so on. You fast forward and look at the Renaissance of Pittsburgh. There was just a recent study that showed that there are about 100 essentially robotics and automation companies, large and small, some of the largest companies in the country that are in autonomous vehicle, in various kinds of robotics automation, and have presence in Pittsburgh, and others have homegrown locally from here. We see that happening across the board, and it's led to 100 companies, and last estimate more than 7,000 or 8,000 direct jobs just in that automation and robotics sector within sort of our regional community. So we did this locally, and then when you go beyond that, we're seeing an insatiable appetite by companies across the world who want to work with us. An example of it is Moderna, who recently actually signed an agreement with us where we have a technology program, education program with them to bring essentially digital technologies, data science, and AI for corporate training across the board. That's sort of on the education side. On the research side and the technology insertion side, we see an insatiable appetite. But your point is absolutely right. The private sector collaborations, we need to double down. We need to grow it. And honestly, we are doing so much on that front, and I'm really pleased with the progress we've made. Some of those companies are coming out of the university, others from outside with whom we work across the globe. But there's no question that research enterprise is expensive. Investing in the future of the country means investing in foundational research, translational research, some of which may come to fruition, some of which may not come to fruition. In fact, all of us sit around and talk about machine learning as if you can go to Best Buy and buy the latest package. It's been as a result of more than 40 to 50 years of basic research investment, primarily by federal government, by the National Science Foundation, by DARPA, by Department of Energy, that led to the advances we've seen in machine learning and artificial intelligence that now coming to fruition and has having such a broad impact almost in every sector of our economy.
I want to put a caution on Farnam's statement, however. I completely agree that the speed up of product cycles and innovation cycles has created these wonderful networks between business and industry in a lot of areas that have been very fruitful for both places. But I do think there are some areas where there really is cause for concern. And To me, one of the real classic examples of this is in the pharmaceutical industry, which has gotten almost entirely out of early stage innovation and wants to have the costs and the time of that, which are very expensive, more and more pushed over onto universities or other research centers. And that's causing serious problems because there are real costs and time here. The industry doesn't want to fund it. You've got to put it, there's a lot of failures in this. That's one reason why the industry doesn't want to fund. But there are situations where I think industries are trying to take advantage of universities rather than partner with them. And I don't know that I have good answers for that, but it's something that I think we have to be careful about and vocal about.
Thank you, Becky.
I agree with Rebecca. I think, and we also have to, we all believe very strongly in the power of data, the advances that have been made in data analytics, AI, etc. But here's the thing. There's a lot of focus, and if we're thinking about national needs and competitiveness, it's not just things that you can do at your computer. And healthcare is a critical area that goes beyond that. But there's this whole question about manufacturing and where does it occur? What happened to our manufacturing sector? That's why I was involved when I was on PCAST with President Obama on this advanced manufacturing study. And so I think the whole set of issues having to do with how does the fourth industrial revolution actually play out in terms of how the digital, the biological, and the physical come together in ways that can rejuvenate the whole economy and not just Boston, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, and San Diego, but now Pittsburgh. I think that's something we really have a challenge with. And I do think some companies are coming to understand that there's talent across a broader swath of the country. And Rebecca, you're in the middle of the country, the Midwest, and two great universities, of course, one that you're at and one you're about to go to, and the South, and Dr. Price, you're sitting there and with Duke and the Research Triangle. So I think we have, and I'm here in upstate New York, if you want to talk about post-industrial. And so I think we have an opportunity to think differently about how we think about what research and what the focus can be, and how these great advances in sectors like AI, computing, et cetera, can rejuvenate and or build up new industries that have to do with the heart of the country. And I think if we don't do that, we're missing a great opportunity.
And to have,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Vince.
I was just going to say, and to have clear-eyed conversations about the costs of all this. To echo what Becky said, the cost of that fundamental research that does take decades to translate into something valuable is extraordinary. It has to be borne by somebody.
Yes.
And I can understand why either the federal government or private enterprise, if they would push that onto universities. But universities will turn to what? Tuitions? No, I don't think so. So people have to be clear-eyed about the actual costs of these different forms of research. The philanthropic sector, as you know, has been, generally speaking, miserable because of an insistence that they will not pay indirect costs. Well, somebody has to pick up the tab for that. So collectively, we just have to have frank conversations about the all-in costs of these activities. We work, as you know, on our own campuses with faculty who all believe that they are revenue centers, and that the revenues that they are generating are being expended somewhere else in the university. But we have to have cross subsidies. We have to have systems that work. And if we drive every tub to its own bottom in this space, that is, I'll fund that research if what I get out of it is this. Those logics will quickly pull the enterprise apart. So that's really the space where we're in. And I would like to see a larger share of research supported by the corporate world. But as Becky said, we need people to understand that basic fundamental R&D is a shared responsibility. We have to come back to this understanding that we all share those costs.
Vince, I totally agree with you, and I would just add to that administrative burden in conducting research has not gone down. I think all of us who've been in this business see that the regulations and policies and administrative burden has grown, while the support for the additional sort of staffing that we need to support research is not being sort of carried by the federal government, let alone the private sector. May I just add one point? I'm glad Shirley and President Jackson brought up advanced manufacturing, because I think it's a great lesson for this country. If you look at the impact of digital revolution on advanced manufacturing and advanced materials, it is actually giving us a roadmap to how this country can regain in prominence in manufacturing. And this was partially the message of President Biden when he was visiting Pittsburgh, which still has a solid manufacturing base. What it's being transformed to is providing, as a result of 3D printing and advanced manufacturing, which is driven by digital technologies, it's actually democratizing, I should say, manufacturing, where a lot of smaller companies and medium-sized companies can actually participate in the manufacturing base of the country. It doesn't mean we've won this. Far from it. Becky has lived in Wisconsin and Michigan, as I have in Michigan as well. We know that the middle of the country, still manufacturing is so important to it. So in fact, embracing some of these emerging technologies, including robotics, to advance our prominence and regain essentially our footing in manufacturing, I think it's extremely important. Particularly, pandemic has shown the importance of, in fact, supply chain and manufacturing, and some of the more recent crises globally has underscored how important that it is, not only to our economic prosperity, but also to the national security of the country.
There's an emerging theme in some of the Q&A on this question of costs and who pays them. And we started talking about the costs being pushed onto the university, but some of the Q&A relates to the cost being pushed onto patients. And really, I think the question comes down to, is all innovation, are all innovative collaborations that universities could get engaged in, are they all equal, or should we be picking and choosing more carefully who our partners should be? And the suspects, I would say, in the Q&A are primarily healthcare and pharmaceutical areas, but if you are going to be engaged in research and development with companies who are driving up healthcare costs or preventing patients from getting the care they need or driving them into bankruptcy, how should universities think about approaching those kinds of collaborations?
I actually believe that it's not going to work unless we get back to the old three-legged stool model of university, industry, government collaboration and support. And I think there's been some difficulty in people coming to where is the public good versus the private good, and where does support for fundamental and some applied research come in there, and where does de-risking and who pays for that? Because that's what we're really talking about. Who de-risks and where in the innovation ecosystem, who pays? And so I think we have to enlarge the conversation. And part of the reason I talked about strategic focus coming from public purposes or national needs is I think that has to be the entry point to try to get back some of the balance we've lost relative to the three-legged stool. As those of you who are in the technical arena know, that a two-legged object, other than perhaps humans sometimes, but a two-legged physical object is never stable. And four legs don't always give you total stability, but three will. Three legs always define a plane. So, but I'm just being fanciful, but I'm being serious.
So I take the question in part as asking, are there research collaborations we should turn down? And like most other places, I suspect all of us at times have turned down research collaborations for two reasons. One is they don't pencil. The revenue just doesn't work out to be worth it, either because of the money being put on the table or the lack of payment for indirects on something where that really matters. And, you know, so there's always a revenue calculation. And there's often usually an IP calculation as well. Is the IP, or is the company you're working with willing to sign the right IP deals? Can your graduate students publish off this? Will your faculty be able to, to get credit for and to use their ideas effectively? Those are the two screens we tend to use. I see some of the chat questions is suggesting there should also be a social value screen to this. That's obviously harder to judge. I suspect many universities at various times have turned down collaborations with certain particular companies that were perhaps problematic in various ways in terms of what they were doing, or at least controversial, I should say. Whether those were the right or wrong decisions, I don't know. It's an issue that we should be talking about more on our campuses, is are there other screens for some of these industry partnerships, and what are they and how would we enforce them?
I would agree that another area that can become sometimes complicated is the nature of the working relationship as it's constructed. You know, access to university faculty and students is something companies want. As Farnam said, we provide a lot of value for these companies if they have that access. But what are the terms of that access, and how can we avoid it becoming an entity within the university that's a kind of sequestered organizationally available to some but not all faculty and students. So there are always those complicated things to work through. With respect to public purpose, I very much like Shirley's observation that reconstituting the public value proposition is something that should be attached to every public investment in research, and it is not always appropriately attached. So to the extent that universities and the public are engaged with these corporate entities, we have collectively an ability to promote uses of those technologies that may not be big revenue generators, but have broad social value. We may have abilities to look for ancillary markets and tertiary uses of technology. So that's where the partnership really does help things. I am a little worried that if any corporate entity puts up enough money, Becky, to come back to your view, if the IP terms look okay and the money's there,
Most of us sign the deal.
do we run the risk of becoming a captured interest? And I think we always have to ask those questions and sort through them. But if you add a third party, particularly if it's a public party, I think it makes all of that a bit easier, frankly.
We have a, go ahead, Farnam, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm glad we both Vince and Becky brought up corporate agreements, because candidly speaking, I mentioned that we're delighted to have all of these partnerships and so on, but there's no question that we're seeing more and more one-off agreements come our way. And one has to be really, really careful about these things, because we make decisions for the university, and exceptions that we make create precedents. And we make decisions that have long-term implications for academic institutions, not just us, but our peers. Because I assure you, when I make a decision for Carnegie-Mellon, because reverse has happened, MIT will hear about it. Duke will hear about it. That CMU is willing to do this. Why won't you do this? And this is not a comment, really a negative comment about the private sector. They are trying to figure out what are the right models of collaboration with universities. And to be really blunt about it, we can't be coin operated. That's just not acceptable. We have a much higher mission to educate the next generation, to benefit society, including some of the intangible benefits that we create for society that cannot be measured just in pure economic terms. So what Vince and Becky said very much resonated with me. And candidly speaking, we talk to our fellow peer institutions about some of agreements that we get. And I assure you, at every turn, we try to hold the line such that we're true to our mission and at the same time be responsive to collaboration with the private sector.
We have a few more minutes, and I wanted to make sure that we talked a little bit about global collaboration and competitiveness before we go. You know, we are in an increasingly competitive landscape globally. Scientists need to be able to work freely, and we want to be able to work collaboratively, and yet there are really serious national security concerns sometimes in international collaboration. So I wanted to end with really a question. I mean, maybe it all boils down to, should universities be more global or less global in their collaborations on innovation?
So I think there's very little question that the US universities have largely moved backwards in terms of globalization, certainly over the last 5 years, maybe the last 10 years. You know, it's harder for people from outside the United States to come to our institutions. It's harder when they graduate from our institutions for them to stay in the United States. And that makes both our industry as well as our universities sort of less open to the world. Now, you could argue the world has, for a variety of reasons, become a more difficult place to operate in, with greater fault lines between some of the big countries. And, you know, certainly the most recent Ukrainian invasion is not going to help that. And we have to pay attention to those sort of global fault lines. But, you know, there's this ideal sense of that universities and science should exist outside and beyond some of the political differences. And indeed, some of those collaborations and connections, I think, have been important in the past to get past and, you know, move into a different future beyond some past political divisions. But you know, I fear that we are in at least in the near future, a less globalized world, not just in the US, but probably in other universities as well.
You know, I would say the following, that, you know, research, you know, I think with the advance of technology and the kind of means we have for people to communicate and collaborate, even without physically traveling, has changed the landscape. But I will say, if you think back about coming out of World War II, and there, you know, a lot of the technologies and a lot of the science was focused on quantum science, and because of things atomic and nuclear and so on. But nonetheless, there were collaborations within certain rules of the game. And I think it's time for universities that's perhaps where collaboration can occur, to think about how does one advance a framework that allows research on fundamental things while being mindful of the need not to propagate intellectual property that can cause national security disadvantage. It's not trivial. I mean, it's not easy, but I think if we don't take it up, then some of it comes in and is imposed on us. So that's you know, how I think about it.
I would agree, and I would just make two observations here. The first is that some of the most pressing challenges we face are global in scale. Climate change, public health. We've just gone through a pandemic, and it strikes me that to pull back on global cooperation in the face of problems of global scale makes no sense. And these are areas where we can explore productive areas of collaboration. You can wall off certain kinds of interactions for the out of interest of security, but it should not come at the expense of this much larger and much more valuable proposition for all of humanity. That's been demonstrated, I think, over millennia when it comes to higher education. We have always been international. You think of the great universities of Europe, which tend to be sort of our orientation as American institutions. The second point I would make is that we're fundamentally in the human talent identification and development business. And that search for talent should be global. It should just, my view is it should be global. We should value everybody. We should not hunger for international students and avoid the talent that's right outside our doors, which is a problem. We shouldn't underinvest in domestic populations, but that's a trade-off we don't have to make. I think a relatively open stance with respect to education is not a good if you can have it, it's a necessary to have feature of the work that we do. So we have to work through reasonable limitations on our activities in the interests of national security, but you know, the interests of our enterprise are at stake if we don't articulate them well and defend them when necessary.
I agree with you, but I will say I don't know that as far as human capital development that we've gotten it quite right in terms of this real equal balance and focus on the domestic talent pool and the international. And you know, we know there are problems, particularly relative to certain groups with the quality of pre-collegiate education. But the statistics I quoted on women's participation in certain of the fields today shows the depth of the problem, because if we did have that balance, we wouldn't have the gender imbalance. And that's before we get to questions of ethnic and cultural diversity, which I think we've not really focused on much at all. But I think these are things that we have to be honest about. And I think there are things we can learn relative to what we would do in the international sphere with attracting and retaining talent that are applicable in terms of addressing domestic problems and vice versa.
We are unfortunately over time. This has been an extraordinarily rich discussion, and I want to thank all four of our university leaders for taking time out of what I know are incredibly busy schedules to share your thoughts with us. And also thank all the people who put questions into the Q&A. There were an abundance of really excellent questions, and I wish we had time to get to all of them. We will be taking a break until 4:30, and then the next panel will begin at 4:30. Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.